Okay, let's get some hands-on work now with JavaScript. First, let's start by just understanding that JavaScript is a programming language all on its own. You can build entire web applications with JavaScript. It's not just a supplemental thing that we add on to HTML and CSS. All three of them together, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all work together to create a perfect environment for building websites. In the old days, and I'm saying here old days, more than 10 years ago, probably more than 20 years ago, JavaScript had a bad reputation. There were a lot of security holes and a lot of exploits that were run by the bad guys against JavaScript on the web. It's gotten much better. And the JavaScript that I'm going to show you in this video is the latest. Because of the bad reputation that JavaScript had, there have been a lot of people, mostly in the United States, who have disabled JavaScript in their browsers. The latest study I saw on this was probably 10 years ago. At that time, it was about 1%, maybe some guessed as high as 2% in the United States. That means that maybe one person who visits your website out of 100 would have JavaScript disabled, and it may be half of that. So maybe it's one person out of 200 people that would visit your website would have JavaScript disabled. Well, what we need to do at the very least is that we need to be polite as web designers. And what I mean by polite, I want to tell the people who might visit my website that this website uses JavaScript, and that if they don't have JavaScript on their computers, then they may have a hard time navigating around in this website. So let's just come in. We're going to do this right after the opening body tag. First line, the very first thing we're going to put in here is something called a no script tag. So just type in no script. No script is a tag. It looks at the browser and asks the browser, do you support JavaScript? If the browser says no, then the user is going to see what we're typing right now. I want to type here, JavaScript needs to be enabled in your browser. Now you might could say something more polite than that. You can be more verbose than that, but we need to at least let our users know that we know that they don't have JavaScript enabled. Now what we're going to do with our JavaScript in this project is very simple, even though the concept of using JavaScript may be completely new to you. I'm going to create a div with a class of theme color, press tab, and then in our theme color we're going to create two buttons. I'm going to create a button, and inside the opening button tag I'm going to type on click. That's the event listener, and it's going to be listening to see whether the user clicks on this button or not. And I'm going to type here light background. Notice the capitalization. I have a lowercase letter L for light, but for the background it's a capital B. We refer to this as camel case. You can think of that capital letter like a camel's hump, camel case. And if you don't spell the word exactly in your code the way that I'm spelling it here, then it will be a mistake and your JavaScript will not work. JavaScript is 100% unforgiving when it comes to making typographical errors. You have to be exactly correct. So just take your time, and then when you try to do something, if it doesn't work, check to see if something was misspelled. So we have created an on-click event inside of our first button. We're going to give this the plain text. This is what we'll show in the button itself. We're going to call it light. Then at the end of this, we're going to do another button. We're going to give it the same kind of code on click, equals. And this is simply going to be dark background. Give it the text of dark. When I saved this, we could see the buttons appear. Notice they're appearing above the nav buttons at the very top, and that's because in the code it's listed first before the nav buttons. But we're going to change the location of these in CSS and put them in the upper left corner of the browser window. Just like we put the top of page link in the bottom right hand corner, we can put those buttons in the upper left hand corner. To do that, we're going to come into Styles, maybe right in here with our other navigation code. We're going to put the class of theme color. The position is going to be fixed. It's going to be top. This time we're going to say 0 and left 0. And then Control S to save that. And now we see that our light and dark buttons pop up to the upper left corner of the screen. We can see there's some overlap here with the Declaration of Independence button and so on. We'll fix all that kind of stuff later. The final touch-up will come when we come and tweak our code when we get to the very end of our project. Come back to Constitution, and I want to grab these first 5 lines. I want to highlight these and copy them, because we're going to put them exactly the same code in here right under the body section on our other pages. They're all going to get exactly the same thing. So we click Declaration, we have the buttons, we click Amendments, we have the buttons. Now all we need to do is give these buttons some JavaScript code to do something. When we come into our Week 6 folder, right-click, create a new file, and we're going to call this myscripts.js. The first thing we're going to do, and this is a really good idea to do with just a lot of stuff, and that is to create a comment. A comment is something that is ignored whenever a browser is reading all of these files. The comment is only for your benefit, or maybe for somebody else's benefit who works on this code later on. And we're just going to give this a descriptive comment here and say that we're about to create functions to change the light and dark theme colors. Now we're going to start right here, and we're going to create what we call a function. And we're going to give that function a name, and this is going to be the name light background, and then it always has the opening and closing parenthesis. In some JavaScript functions, we will put something inside the parenthesis that are called parameters. And some people refer to them as arguments, but you're going to have to learn more about JavaScript to understand what that's all about. But just understand that it's not going to be a function if you don't give it the right name spelled correctly. And notice that this is spelled exactly the same way that we spelled it here in our HTML pages, light background with the opening closing parenthesis. And then we come after we have our curly braces opened up, and here we're going to type document body style background. It starts with document, which is everything from the HTML tag all the way down, and then we're selecting the body element, and what we're saying is that the style that we want for the body element is going to have its background changed, and what we're going to do with this equals and then a color value, and I'm going to use the hex values for these colors. The first 2 letters means red, the second 2 mean green, the last 2 letters mean blue, and F is the highest value in hexadecimal. So this says give me all of the red, all of the green, all of the blue, and whenever you do that, when you get 100% of red, green, and blue, you have the color white. The next one we want, document body style, You can change the style here of the color. Color always refers to the font color. Use the hex value again, and I'm going to make this all black. Your hex values will always have 6 characters. And if you have all Fs, that's the highest, that's all of the possible colors mixed together, that's white. And when you have none of the possible colors, then that's black. Now the next line is a little bit longer. Document. And here we're going to do something called query selector. And then we're going to have all. Query selector all. In our CSS files, what we put in front of the opening curly brace is a selector. And what it does, the body selector is selecting the body element. Our H1, H2, H3 selectors are selecting H1 tags, H2 tags, and H3 tags. So you're already familiar with the term selectors. And in JavaScript right now, what we're doing is we're running a command that says query all of those selectors. Let's ask them a question. And when we do query selector all in our parenthesis, we're going to have to put in quotation marks. We're going to refer to the selector that we want to get in touch with. And here it's amendments. We are trying to reach down into our CSS code. We're looking for the selector that's called amendments. And then we're going to change some values relative to the amendments. So we're going to query selector all, and we're going to reference our class of amendments. And we want the UL that's inside of the amendments. And we want all of the LIs, and then we want to reach down and touch the anchor tags. So read this with me. We're reading for the anchor tag that's inside of an LI, that's inside of a UL, it's inside of the class called amendments. Now what do we want to do with that? Put a dot, and we're going to have here a bunch of possible different commands that we can use. The one we're going to do, because the query selector is looking for all, everything. That means every list item, every anchor, everything that's found inside of the selector for class amendments. So we have to treat each of them independently. And so we're going to have a command that says for each, and then open a parenthesis again. And we're going to say for each item that we find, and then we're going to use, it's called an arrow function. It's going to have the equal sign followed by a greater than symbol. It makes it look like an arrow. And we're going to say here, for every item, we want the item style dot color, and we want that to equal. And then here we're going to use the opening quotes and then the hash symbol for the hex value. And we're going to say we want a color that has no red, no green, but we want every bit of blue that you've got. So we're going to close that with a semicolon. And then we're going to come down and do our next one. Function is going to be just like the other. Dark background. Opening and closing parenthesis. Opening and closing curly braces. And we can just do some copying here. I'm going to copy all of this. I'm going to paste it in down here. Because now what we want to do for the background, this time we don't want it to be white. This is going to give our users a dark background whenever they click that button. For our dark background, here I'm going to show you that we can just use the 3 values for our number. And in reality, if you go and look this color up on the internet, it'll be expressed with 6 fours. But again, if you have 6 and they're all the same, you can just express 3 of them. Up here we had black for the color of the font, and down here we want to have white for the color of the font. And then we're going to also say query selector all, amendments UL, LIs, and A's for each, the item, and and then the arrow function, item, color, and we're going to change this now to the item colors are going to have to all be white. And the reason they have to be white will be obvious whenever we get to looking at our pages. And guys, that's it. That is a JavaScript file. It's got two functions defined in it. You have one function to do one thing, this other function does another, and the user will be the decider. So there's one last thing we have to do. We have to come into Constitution. Guess I should have done this earlier, but we have to come into our HTML files. And in the same way that in our HTML files, we created a link element that linked this web page to that style sheet, we're going to have to do something similar for each of our HTML pages so that our HTML pages can see the JavaScript file. But we don't use a link element. What we have to do is use a script tag, and the script tag will look like this. Script, we have to come inside the opening JavaScript tag, and instead of href, then we're going to use a different attribute, and this one is called src, which stands for source. The source of this script tag that we're looking for is a file called my scripts, and obviously you can see it pop up here with IntelliSense, and when you see it, and if it's highlighted, you can just press tab and it selects it and keeps you from misspelling it. Come right after that closing quotation mark though. Make sure you're staying inside the opening and closing brackets here. And there's a super important word you have to put here, defer. And what this is telling us is that here is the link to where our JavaScript code can be found, but we're telling the browser that when you get down here, go ahead and look at the location, see where it's at, but we're saying defer. Don't do anything that's inside the JavaScript file until the browser gets all of the rest of the body content rendered. Now it's going to happen in the blink of an eye. You're not going to see any difference at all. But if you don't put defer, then you're going to start getting all kinds of error messages whenever your page is trying to be rendered, because it's trying to do JavaScript, and JavaScript cannot work until all of these tags that we've been building are rendered and placed on the page. So the first thing the browser does, it puts all the content on here, and then it goes back to the JavaScript file, and it will read that JavaScript and apply the changes that we want it to make. Back in the old days, we had to take this, it had to be placed all the way at the very bottom, and we put it between the closing body and the closing HTML tags. We put that tag way down here because we didn't want the JavaScript to do anything until all of our code had been read. Now we can put it at the top of the document because the script tag now has a command in it that says to defer taking any action. So now when I come to Constitution, if I come up and click on dark, our readers can have a dark page. If I click on light, it takes them back to the light view. If I click on amendments and click on dark, I get the dark. And this is the reason that we made all of these links over here white, so that you'd be able to read these fragment links to the amendments. If they were just in blue, it'd be very hard to read them. One of the things you have to keep in mind is this whole thing about accessibility. There has to be enough contrast between the colors that you're using on your website and the visual problems that your users may have. They may not be able to see what's on your page if there's not enough contrast between them. And so that's the reason that I chose the colors and the shapes and everything that I did for the nav buttons up here, is that I wanted these buttons to be able to stay the same regardless of whether I use the dark theme or the light theme, because those buttons work fine either way. The JavaScript functions that I wrote, I didn't have to make any changes at all to any of our nav elements.